What centuries were known as the Italian Renaissance? I don't know. 300, 400, why not 1300, 1400? Historians say mille is implied. Should we discuss the date of Christ's birth? Ultimately, whether we like it or not, all of human history is linked to Christ's birth date. Few people know who determined that date. The date of Christ's birth was first calculated in the 6th century, more than 500 years after Christ's supposed birth, by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus. How did he determine Christ's birth date? The birth of Christ, the figure of Christ, not only did not appear 3,000 years after the birth of civilization, but is practically the first written record, the first historical milestone of human civilization. Why is it such a fundamental backbone? Because he wasn't just any poor carpenter's son in the Syrian-Palestinian Levant.
Who did the reviewers say Christ was?
An emperor? Let's see.
How is that possible?
He was an emperor who also fought against corruption and the elites, who were largely his own family. This has been reflected in the Byzantine chronicles as the struggle of Andronicus III with Neno, which is one of the secular reflections of Christ in the non-religious chronicles, against the branch that sought to ascend to the throne, which was the Angelos family, and from there comes the rebellion of the angels against God. Goodbye.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Factory. In this episode, we are going to talk about a very controversial topic. We have Mikael Berberian with us, a person who claims that history is not as we have been told, that it has chronological flaws, and that there are several inconsistencies. And I'm here to question where that way of thinking comes from. I want to know what led him to draw these conclusions, and I think it's going to be a very entertaining journey. I'm really looking forward to interviewing him. Welcome, Mikael. How are you?
Hello, Jota. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
The first question I want to ask you is that history is not a science.
That's right. First, to understand it well, to lay some groundwork, you have to understand that history has two definitions. One material and one formal, so that everyone understands. It's the structure of history, which is events arranged along a timeline, and that timeline is the chronology. That's the formal definition, and then there's the material definition, which is the content of history. That is the subject matter, which could be summed up in two words: historiography and politics. Historiography is the reintegration, interpretation of the past. And politics. Everyone knows it's about the struggle for power. Those who have it want to keep it, and those without want to get it. Therefore, history, in its material and formal definition, if we combine the two, gives us the result that it cannot be a science in any way. Because a science, first of all, has a methodological, empirical basis. It doesn't really have to depend on the observer. Alright, you and I can be in different places. For example, around the globe, water has the same composition and boils at the same temperature under the same atmospheric pressure. History depends on who wrote it, when they wrote it, and for what purpose, alright? What's more, a historian, doesn't study what is, because history, what is it? History is the past, right? The historian doesn't study what really happened. He studies what has been passed down to us by other people. Therefore, there's always a significant epistemological barrier in history. Therefore, from that point of view, it can't be a science in any way. Obviously, nowadays it's, so to speak, social sciences, humanities, and so on. But it doesn't have, it doesn't have the same evidentiary weight as a fundamental science like chemistry, physics, astronomy, and so on. So, history, as I've already said, has that barrier to knowledge, which is that we only study what has reached us, right? Either in writing or in the material record. And the problem with the material record, which is where we would also get into other issues, like, for example, the auxiliary sciences of history, which we can talk about now if you want. No, because history, as I told you in its formal definition, is events arranged along a timeline, which is chronology. Chronology is the only part that was born, tending to be scientific, because chronology, at first, mathematicians structured it with primitive methods. Back then, in ancient times, to build that backbone, which in the end is the backbone of history. While all the events, the kings, the happenings, and so on, that's the flesh, the skin, and so on, but the skeleton is the chronology, and it has to be built. How? That's where people don't understand. Not even historians themselves really know what history is, nor can they let's say, defend the discipline that gives them their livelihood. And this, many people might think that I'm some kind of, I don't know, well, me and many other people, in fact, I'm a history graduate, okay? I mean, I know the basics and the foundations of official history. And at the same time, I defend a revisionist stance on history. Because what is revisionism? It's simply, let's say, reviewing, or rather, no, to be redundant, from the root, all the postulates of history in any science, which is another reason not to consider history a science. It has a birth, a development, and a revolution within itself. Okay, physics is not the same when it was born as a science as the one we know today, nor is astronomy or anything else. However, history has never undergone a revolution within itself. That is, history has always, let's say, developed in layers. But the foundation of history has never been reviewed. In non-physics, today, nothing.
I have a question. Why do you advocate for reviewing history? What have been the events or inconsistencies that have led you to think that this revolution in history should take place?
Well, look, that's a very good question, really. I mean, nothing is ever invented, okay? It's always like that. You stand on the shoulders of giants and take over from others. I'm just a mere popularizer, I'm not a researcher. All I do is, let's say, spread this revisionist movement, which actually started in the 16th century. In fact, at the University of Salamanca, okay, with Professor de Arcila, who wrote two main works that have not been preserved because they ended up on the list of prohibited books. There are simply a few fragments left that are quoted by other authors. But what is known is that those two works, which were Divina y Flora Historica and Programma Historia Universalis, basically reviewed all existing chronology from the ground up. And the question is, why? Did it start in the 16th century? Because in the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, but mainly in the 16th century, two works emerged. Magnificent, by two key chronologists who were theologians, one a Jesuit, Joseph Scaliger, and Dionysius Petavius. They were the ones who laid the foundations of chronology as we know it today. That is to say, everything we know today about ancient Egypt, Sumer, Mesopotamia, everything, absolutely all the dates.
2000 before Christ.
Everything, they established it. The problem is that their version wasn't the only one at that time. It's the one that won, okay? It's the one that won. Meanwhile, within academic circles, there were other people who said that their version was incorrect. That is to say, from the very birth of this chronology, which we still use today, 400 years later, without questioning it, it was already criticized when it was created. Starting, as I said, with Professor Arcila from the University of Salamanca. There were many others who, logically, as I mentioned, and now maybe one of the names I'm going to mention will surprise you. There were many other scholars, experts, scientists, who said that ancient history, and by history, I mean not the real past that actually happened, which we will never know unless we have a time machine,
but rather as what we've been told.
Exactly, but rather history, understood as the written record, mainly the written record, especially from ancient times, what is considered antiquity, which would begin approximately. No, here we're talking about a year more or less. So around 3000 before Christ, and it would go up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, officially 476. So would that be considered antiquity? Well, many scholars from the 16th century onwards said that all those works, which coincidentally also started to appear relatively recently, which now, if you want, we'll also get into the question of when the documents appear, the beginning of the chain of custody, which detectives and investigators know very well. They said that all those works were actually created in the offices of the humanists. They are not original works. In fact, there is no original, there are no originals of the works. Neither from Tacitus, no Plautus, no Suetonius, no Diodorus Sanchez. There are no originals, they are all copies, late medieval or even from later centuries. Then, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was another great scholar named Jan Harwin, who was also a Jesuit. Okay, I'm going to mention the Jesuits a lot in this.
Iru Landuzi will love this podcast.
I know perfectly well. In fact, Iru is also very knowledgeable about this topic. I know that. So, Jan Harwin said precisely he was the one who argued that all these works were created, as I said, during the Renaissance and later centuries. All right? There were many others. I'm not going to mention them all to you. Robert Waldorf, Edwin Johnson. There were many other scholars who, let's say, questioned and criticized the official version. Both the chronology, which is the skeleton, and what is the body, the flesh, which is the history, the events, and so on. But there is one very important who might surprise you, who is the scientist par excellence, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton. Indeed, look at this. Isaac Newton was, let's say, labeled as crazy precisely for dedicating himself to chronology. That is to say, he was a scientist, let's say, excellent, of great renown. As I said, I think that today he is the typical example of a polymath, right? That is a person who from a young age was an expert in many fields. But what a coincidence that when he wanted to dedicate himself to history, especially chronology, he published a book called Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms and Mendels. That is corrected chronology of the ancient kingdoms, and then the subtitle is from the earliest known times to the creation. The Conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great, that's, let's say, his main work, and they call him crazy. Why? Because he said that by doing, let's say, a recalculation of dates, okay? Because now, if you want, we can also get into how chronology as such came about. That is how we know when events happened, because someone had to create that. It's not a divine revelation that falls from the sky. It's not something organic. It doesn't just sprout from the ground like mushrooms. No, that had to be created by someone. If you want, now, as I said, we can get into that. But first, Isaac Newton did something absolutely revolutionary for his time. And it's that he didn't just say that logically all of history needs to be reviewed, because documents can be forgeries or copies or whatever, but in fact taking the existing documents as a basis, because in the end you have to work with what you have. He came to the conclusion that history had to be compressed, okay? That is, for example, in the official chronology that we still use today. The Egyptian civilization would have started more or less in 3000 right before Christ, but for Isaac Newton it was around 984 before Christ. That is, he took away 2000 years, okay? He compressed 2000 years of Egyptian history, and logically, not just the history of Egypt, because in the end, what we have are direct and indirect synchronisms. If you alter the history of a civilization like the Egyptian, which had contact with the Greek and the Greek with the Roman, and you start pulling on that Gordian knot, okay, you try to untie the knot, in the end you can't just review one part of history, you have to review it completely. Logically, as I said, that work by Newton was never taken into account. It exists as a mere curiosity. People read it and so on. But the usual thing, since he did it in the last years of his life, okay, what people usually use is the typical ad hominem fallacy. Well, since he was old, the old man was senile, so he couldn't think of anything else but to say those nonsense things. And that's the level of criticism that Newton receives regarding that work. No one has, let's say, subjected it to formal scientific criticism.
I have a question, but isn't history investigated as a whole? The official account, for example, doesn't consider that Roman civilization was in contact with the Egyptian one, with Julius, Caesar, Mark Antony, Cleopatra. That is, a consensus has been reached about what history is. With what interest? The point I see is, if one account won, isn't that account more verifiable than the other?
No, because that's another fallacy. It's the populum fallacy, meaning that just because many people say something doesn't mean it's true.
I agree with that, but the point is, when two views of history face off at the academic level, it's still not clear to me what is the other one. I'd like to know which one is it. How has it lasted so long? If it's a major deception, what's the purpose? Here we love deceptions, we know they exist. The point is, what's the intention behind the deception?
That's also a very good question. Look, the story as a whole, as I said, for example, was even criticized by official historians. We shouldn't think that this is just something from a few out-of-touch people, because it's not. Another criticism is that they're conspiracy theorists. Conspiracy theorists, but also, look, another criticism is always, let's say, appealing to the field of study of a scholar. Since Isaac Newton wasn't a historian, the criticism is, why is a non-historian involved in history? Typical, right? If a mathematician points out flaws in history, people say he's just a mathematician, not a historian. That is, the criticisms are always like that, but even within official historical circles, there's a great historian that everyone who is interested in 19th century ancient history will know, a German named Theodor Mommsen, okay? He himself was part of a movement called exactly hypercriticism. And he presents hundreds of examples that in official history don't match up with what, for example, is found in the documents. Because when the chronological tables were made, for example, by John Blair and others, in the end, as you say, there's a version that prevails, but within the documents, even within the primary sources, You can read things that later don't match up with what other historians have, let's say, intentionally adjusted so that it starts to fit. So with this brief clarification made, what is the intention? This is where, let's say, the conspiracy theory always comes into play. People call it conspiracy theory, conspiracy theorists, and so on and so forth. What people need to understand is something very simple. When this chronological version and this historical version were being created, it wasn't done with malice. What happens is that when the chronology was put together, which is what I was going to talk about, as I told you, if you want, we can go back to that first. And you just hit the nail on the head when the official chronology that we still use today was put together. I'm just asking you, let's see, what do you think? What methods could they have used? In the 16th century, when sciences didn't really exist as such. There was no radiocarbon dating, no dendrochronology, no thermoluminescence, all of that came later. How do you put together a global chronology based on what? Do you have a series of documents? How do you put it together? An unbroken line that goes from a point in the past, a starting point, all the way to the present, which is when those works are created?
I imagine it's through the study of documents and all the records that existed at that time.
Of course, but how do you determine the dates? That's a good question, a good question.
Exactly, that's a very good question. So now I'm going to ask you a question and now go on. Can't carbon-14 tests be done on those documents nowadays?
On the document itself, yes. The problem is this, like,
for example, the pyramids. If it's claimed that the pyramids of Egypt were built in 700 before Christ,
it depends, since there are so many that supposedly count.
The Nida and all these big ones.
The 3rd millennium before Christ?
3rd millennium, that is 3?
About 2,000 years before Christ, supposedly.
All right, I thought it was 700 years, all right? You can't do carbon-14 testing on those.
Carbon-14, just to make a small parenthesis. And now we'll continue with the other thing. It's only useful for dating organic samples. And besides, carbon-14, if you want, we can pause here and I can explain carbon-14.
I thought you could do it with anything.
No. Carbon-14 is only useful for dating organic samples, tissue from living beings, plants, animals.
Documents work because they're made from animal skin?
That's quite an important problem, because the document itself, the age of the parchment, for example, doesn't really tell you when the document was written, because I can take an old parchment, which is known as a palimpsest, that is, old parchments that when they were erased and couldn't be read anymore, were written over. So what's written on top isn't from the date when the parchment was made. Yeah, I understand. That is the analysis of the material itself on which it's written doesn't tell you anything about the content of the document itself either, right? But carbon-14 also, when it was invented, when Willard Libby, the creator of carbon-14, won the Nobel Prize for it, of course. Really, if you read his reports, right? And everything he wrote, he says it has, let's say, a fundamental error, though he doesn't put it that way. But someone who studies how the method was calibrated understands that he first took the existing dates as correct, and based on that, he calibrated his method. What he did was something very simple, which is to take a few samples of, let's say, wood, right? From a known period, the last 3 centuries, right? That is a traceable, known, easy period. He saw how much carbon degradation there was, carbon-14, right? That is, he calculated the carbon decay curve and then simply did a rule of 3. If in 3 centuries it has this decay, it means, well, that in 5 centuries it will be X less and so on if in 10. You get it, right? Pretty simple. What happens is that Litby himself in his works says, since we trust the chronology of Rome and Egypt, we didn't do the analyses on all the samples we could have done. And then when they started doing control samples, like let's do a few random samples to see if the method matches up, problems started to arise, discrepancies started to appear within the carbon dating results, because carbon-14 doesn't give a single date. It gives, let's say, a range, which you then have to adjust. And something very important, when an archaeologist finds something at a site, for example, they don't just find a wool garment and say, let's do carbon-14 dating on it. When he goes to the laboratory, the procedure to follow is that he first says, which site is it from, which culture does it supposedly belong to, and what is the chronology he already has in mind.
Is he already fully influenced by the official narrative?
Exactly. So when a physicist chemist analyzes that sample, the physicist chemist doesn't care at all. Okay? Whether it's from the Argaric culture, Iberian, Celtiberian, or Roman, the physicist chemist gets paid to do his analysis in his lab. He doesn't care. You tell him it's from the 3rd century, and he just says, oh, okay. No matter what results he gets, he says, well, I found it's from this century. There's a kind of spread of dates from the 1st century to the 5th. It more or less matches what you told me, but from the 1st to the 5th century is a 500-year difference. What is the correct date? If the archaeologist didn't give the physicist chemist, let's say, a guideline, something to suggest to him, at first, which dates would they lean toward? The oldest or the most recent? If you don't tell them anything, that's a very good question. That's regarding the method. I mean, really, Libby's Nobel Prize wasn't so much for the precision of the method as for how revolutionary, let's say, his approach was. A lot of control samples were made. I'll give you a few quick examples. Some seals that had been hunted just a few decades ago showed an age of hundreds of years according to carbon-14. Some freshly caught mollusks showed an age. Are you going to laugh? Not only were they not older than believed, but according to their carbon content, they still had 300 years to be born. That is, if you only analyze the carbon content, these were things that were practically from your present. Based on their carbon content, they could be hundreds of years old and might not even have been born yet. In other words,
it's not the best method.
It's not the best method. Many will tell you that no. But in recent years, it has been calibrated very well and has been perfected. It's accurate to within about 10 years. That's a lie, okay? That's a lie. That's something that needs to be reformulated, reanalyzed, and recalibrated. Recalibrated with what? With the dates, okay? What's happening? That the dates at first were constructed based on mathematics. Scaliger and Petavius, the ones I mentioned to you, Jesuits, one of them was Petavius, Denis Petot in French, but Latinized, he was Dionysius Petavius. They used to Latinize names a lot. It was something very typical of that time. Let's say that those two used mathematics and astronomy to compose that chronological axis. Okay, so how? Very simple. During the reign of such and such king, there was a lunar eclipse in the 3rd year. I'm making this up, not the king, X. There was a lunar eclipse. You can calculate when that eclipse supposedly happened. If it's a king, I'm making this up, an Athenian king. In the 3rd century before Christ, it says that in his X year of reign, there was an eclipse. You can calculate it since eclipses can be determined for both the future and the past. And you can see if an eclipse passed through that strip of land, if there was a lunar eclipse, how long it took to be seen, and so on and so forth. So they adjusted the chronology using astronomy. Besides, there was another method logically, which is Roman chronology, because Roman chronology is the backbone of all chronology, not only in Europe, but in the world. This is crucial and must be considered. Why? Because until very recently, we used the Julian calendar, which supposedly comes from Rome, right? Then there was, let's say, the calendar reformed by Gregory, which is why we use the Gregorian calendar today. But until then, in the Orthodox Church, especially in Russia, for example, the Julian calendar is still used today. So the dates are a certain number of days ahead, 13 days and so on. What happens? That all of Rome's history is connected to the history of Greece, to the history of Egypt, to the history of the East, the Middle East, the Near East. So the history of Rome, let's say, is directly linked to the oldest civilizations of Eurasia, not counting, of course, China. That's a separate topic. Okay, that's a separate topic. But let's first go to the topic of the Mediterranean, to what concerns us more or less. So once you structure the Roman chronology, all you really have to do is fit the rest of the chronologies and the rest of the eras, end of calendars and so on, to the chronology of Rome. How is Rome's chronology organized? Supposedly, it's easy. They tell you there were 2 consuls per year, okay, 2 consuls per year, that supposedly the Fasti Consulares have been preserved, a list of consuls. Supposedly that's not true. It's true, in part, there's a list of consuls, okay, but that list of consuls is a copy made in the late Middle Ages and completed by humanists. The originals don't exist. And a modern chronologist named Elias Bickerman from the 20th century said that there is actually absolute chaos within the fasti consulares. Because the way they are now, when you look at them and say, oh, that's very nice, it's perfect, everything is well organized, it seems like everything is very well put together. But like a good investigator in a murder case, you have to, let's say, pull from here and pull from there. Because the story can be set up very well, and lawyers and detectives know that perfectly well. You can weave anything together excellently. The problem is that it has to be subjected to criticism. And once you find a small flaw and start pulling, you see that everything is a house of cards. So, within the Roman chronology, within the consular fasti, the originals, I repeat, have not been preserved, they are copies. And those copies were completed, as I said, with fragments of information. And on many occasions, the modern chronologists themselves say that there are years in which it is not known who was consul, or anything at all. While historians logically say yes, since it's ultimately a consensus, referring back to your point about consensus. Recapping, you can stop me and ask me whenever you want. Recapping. Scaliger and Petavius wrote 4 fundamental works: Opus Novum de Emendatione Temporum Thesaurus Temporum by Scaliger, and De Doctrina Temporum Irrationari Temporum, which is by Petavius. Time in a rational way, yes, let's say rationalizing time, improved time, the new work about improved time, and so on. In the end, they are pretty simple names. The only thing they say is, look, they're not titled New Creation. It's improved. That's very important. Improved. By whom? There were already previous chronological works, but they were quite rough. They still didn't have a well-established mathematical methodology. And above all, the subject of astronomical dating, logically, in the 16th and 17th centuries was much more perfected. We're already talking about the post-Copernican era, also the time of Tycho Brahe, a great astronomer. Even Kepler himself, in fact, Johannes Kepler, was invited to collaborate with Scaliger and Petavius. Then he said a very good phrase: Scaliger seduced me, but as I see it, the study of chronology terrifies me. That is, Scaliger seduced me, but not in the sense of seduction as we understand it today. Rather, he led me a bit off the path. I am terrified by what I see. The study of chronology, that is, even in Kepler's own time, a great astronomer, the subject of chronology still seemed to have unstable foundations. So, astronomy was needed to, let's say, give it solidity, to provide an authoritative argument. Because if a great astronomer says that if we've calculated an eclipse correctly, a solar eclipse, a lunar eclipse, a comet, etc., then it's well calculated. The works prior to those great chronological treatises, those, notice how curious, supposedly go back. The first serious chronological compilation was supposedly done by Eusebius of Caesarea, supposedly, or Eusebius Pamphili, in the 4th century. If you want to ask, go ahead and ask. If not, I'll continue now.
All right, okay. Look, I'm getting confused. You're giving me a lot of names. And at the end of the day, I think the audience will feel the same way. I'm just a bit overwhelmed. I want to bring it down to earth a bit more. And what I mainly want to ask you is, what is the very down-to-earth revisionist version? What is it? The story isn't as we've been told, right? What really happened? Were there many more years or a lot fewer? The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa didn't happen, and it wasn't in 1212. Rome didn't fall in 476, and the Muslims didn't besiege the island of Capri in 800. I don't know how much the Muslims didn't enter Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, in 711. That's what I'm getting at. What's the other version? What's the deception? What's the intention behind the deception?
Before saying what the other version is, what I have to say quickly is, without giving names or anything, it's not a planned deception. There are 2 layers.
There's no conspiracy, right?
At first, mistakes were made, serious mistakes that were based on the imperfection of the science of the time. Okay, so serious mistakes were made. So you can understand it easily. The same short story was quadrupled, okay, into 4 different versions. And not knowing that it was the same story told in a different region, written in a different language, using different names, and so on, not understanding that it was the same story, inevitably. It had to be earlier, and the third one is different from the second, so it had to be even earlier. And that's how they created a false long story, because of mistakes. It's not a conspiracy, okay? It's a typical mistake of, let's say this, now we're getting into issues of hermeneutics, of interpreting the sources. You can take, let's say, two documents that describe the same event but written by different people. You, for example, you and I can narrate
this meeting
in a different way.
I'll narrate in English, you in Spanish.
You, for example, focus on my physical appearance, and I focus, for example, on how well I spoke. We're narrating, it seems, and then you start adding up the differences. And a person who, let's say, doesn't go deeper into the subject says they don't seem to be discussing the same thing, so these events are different. Now then, you and I know that we're talking about the same thing. So we would need to find a method to determine the dry residue, a method that tells us, are you and I really talking about the same thing, even if we're describing it differently? And there are times when those differences aren't just, let's say, minor or superficial issues. For example, in a battle, you realize that the battle is what it is. But some say, well, there were 100,000 of them, and others say, well, there weren't that many, there were 2,000. We're talking about chronicles that, if you look at them, you might say they have nothing to do with each other. But mathematics reveals that, yes, they are dependent on each other, which means they have a common original source, and that's simply what it is. After copying, let's say the divergences began, which in the end is like the game of telephone. If you've ever played it, we've all played it as kids with 10 people. One person whispers a word to someone else, and by the end, the word changes. Even with good intentions, errors build up, resulting in a series of mistakes. There was no global conspiracy of two people who got together and started writing that. I'll make this parenthesis, the other story. All the revisionists I've mentioned to you, from de Archila onwards up to Isaac Newton, for some reason, all of them. In the end, the conclusion was the same. History has to be shorter than the official version we still use today. Okay? Shorter, the shorter. That's where the scientific methodology comes in to verify it. And if you want, we can now get into which methodology. There are 4 main methods to verify it.
Before I continue, I have a question. In the 16th century, during the Renaissance, people didn't think of themselves as living in the 16th century.
No, I mean,
they didn't say, we're in the 16th century, like we say we're in the 21st century now.
They called them the centuries of the Italian Renaissance. I have no idea. 300, 400.
Why?
Where is 1300 or 1480? The official historians tell you that the 1000 was implied. Do you want us to talk about the date of Christ?
Let's see what you tell me. I mean, because of course one always tends to judge things from their own perspective. And I also thought that they in the 16th century were perfectly aware that they were in the 16th century. Not at all. I mean, no. This is a chronological consensus that was reached precisely in that century. And I'm really curious about what you just mentioned. They said they were in the 300th century and in the 400th century. Let's see, then explain it to me, because for me that's okay.
Look, the date of Christ's birth, because in the end, whether we like it or not, all of human history is tied to the date of Christ's birth. Because logically, in the end, history is tied to all of universal history. Let's say the main one is the European, because in the end we Europeans were, let's say, the civilization that stood out, the civilization that dominated, and therefore all knowledge was Eurocentric. It has always been Eurocentric. The date of Christ's birth is extremely important because it's a chronological milestone even today. That's why when people say that Christ didn't exist and so on, there's always the joke, right? But what year are you in? 2025. After whom? Very few people know who calculated the date of Christ's birth, because that wasn't a tradition that had always been known. The date of Christ's birth was first calculated in the 6th century, about 500 years after Christ's supposed birth, by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus. All right? How did he calculate the date of Christ's birth? First, did he calculate his death? How? Because according to the Gospels, when Christ was crucified, there was an eclipse.
A solar eclipse and also the temple.
Okay, but the main thing is the eclipse, which in the end is a celestial astronomical event that you can date by following a series of considerations. He calculated an X date for his death, and all he did afterward was subtract 33 years, which is the tradition. That Christ died at 33 years old. Okay, first he calculated his death and then subtracted 33 years. Simple. And you say, okay, In the 6th century, the date of Christ's birth was established. Great. From the 6th century on, everyone knew they were living in such and such a year after Christ. Well, look how curious it is that in the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, remember that the Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 and the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453, almost 1,000 years later at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. Alright, so it turns out that the Byzantine Empire, which never had any breaks, which was an uninterrupted empire from the separation between Honorius and Arcadius, between the Western and Eastern Roman empires, which supposedly was the first empire to adopt Christianity. First, supposedly it was Armenia as the official state religion. Then there were also Ethiopian Christians. There were also Coptic Christians in Egypt. But officially, the empire that adopts Christianity is the Eastern Roman Empire. The Greeks, and you say the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century. They didn't know when adopting Christianity. When Christ was born, because it was calculated in the 6th century 300 years later, a little over 200 years later. And it turns out that when Dionysius Exiguus calculated the date of Christ's birth, the Byzantine Empire, a deeply Christian empire that would take many more centuries to fall, supposedly, until the 14th century, from the 6th century to the 14th 700 years, they didn't know when Christ was born. His date of birth was still being debated, even though Dionysius Exiguus had already calculated it. That is to say, we are facing a, let's say, an oddity within official history itself. And the thing is, the Byzantine Empire didn't know the date Christ was born. The Byzantine Empire used a different kind of dating, which was the date from the creation of the world or from Adam. That's why it's known as the Byzantine era, if you want. Now let's get into how easily that date was calculated. Does the inconsistency keep surprising me? Okay, so what happens is that they tell you, come on man, please. There are documents that use Anno Domini, the date from the birth of Christ, which are, I'm going to make this up, but they tell you there are some from the 7th or 8th century. The papal chancellery used the Anno Domini calculation, meaning from the birth of Christ, for the first time in the year 1431. What happened that the papal chancellery, Rome didn't know when Christ was born. How long did it take from the 6th century to 1431, the 15th century, to adopt the Anno Domini date in Rome? The Byzantines, as I said, never adopted it. They used the Byzantine era or from Adam. Was the Byzantine era calculated from Adam? Here you have to understand a movement called scholasticism, which I don't know if you're familiar with. It was nothing more than, let's say, the attempt to make Aristotelian philosophy fit and align with Christian theology. That is, to give Christian theology a certain scientific basis. Okay, primitive at that time, but scientific. Is scholasticism important? Because, of course, there wasn't a starting point. A long time ago, there wasn't a starting point. Everything was counted using 3 cycles. The cycle or the circle of the sun, which was from 1 to 28. And why start from 1 and not 0? 0 wasn't a concept yet. It was introduced much later. We can discuss more mathematical topics if you want. 0 didn't exist because 0 is nothing more than making something present. Absence is, let's say, a human invention. 0 doesn't exist. 0 is nothing, okay? We use it in positional calculation. The Romans didn't, the Babylonians didn't, they didn't use 0, the Greeks didn't, okay? 3 circles, I repeat. The circle to the sun from 1 to 28, the circle to the moon from 1 to 19, and the indiction from 1 to 15. And you have to imagine, and the viewers watching should imagine, that in the past, dates were recorded, as I said, not like now, from a certain year, from a certain event. No. Instead, 3 little wheels were used, okay, which would add 1 unit, and when they reached the maximum unit, they would go back to the main unit. You have to imagine it like a lock with 3 little wheels that you turn, and when you go from 9 back to 0, which in this case would be 1, okay? So you have to imagine 3 little wheels. In the past, the documents, what are you saying, Mika? In the past, documents were dated as in the 17th solar cycle, 3rd lunar cycle, 5th indiction. Did such an event happen? And you say, how do I know what year this is? He knew that, he put it together. How the hell am I supposed to know what year it is, right? So they said, let's make a starting point so it's not so confusing, because in the past they used the hand of Damaskinos, or of John of Damascus. Okay? Him. SUP, very complicated. One, if we don't say the mathematical discipline, very primitive, very primitive, very complicated. So to understand it, it's very confusing. But it's simple. It was just a starting date, and from there we start counting years and stop messing around with little rolls and nonsense. What did they do? Super trivial, they said. Let's just multiply the three numbers, at least as a multiple. 28 times 19 times 15. 7,980. What is 7,980? The era of creation. Why within scholasticism was it said, well, it's said that God created the world in how many days? 7. Supposedly not 6, and on the 7th he rested. Each day of the creation of the world is a millennium, period. So more or less, 7,986,000, well, we've already calculated it more or less. When it was created, let's say the era of creation took place, and that calculation is the one that was used in the Byzantine Empire. But watch out, when the Byzantine Empire fell. Within Russia, which was the heir of Byzantium, the era from the creation continued to be used until relatively recently. In fact, in many European countries, the date wasn't adopted until the 17th century, even the 18th century. Let's say the Anno Domini reckoning and all that. Look at what I've told you. That is, how many centuries of delay supposedly between a monk who calculated when Christ was born until all the deeply Christian countries, and who supposedly said, let's say, no, Viedad, it was already calculated and mostly known. And besides, it is known that Christ lived during the time of Herod, and we know that Herod was, let's say, king in such and such a year, because there was a consul, because of this and that. That is, as you start looking into it, it turns out it's not that easy. It turns out that many minds had to make tremendous efforts to calculate it. So I ask myself, well, not just me, a lot of people wondered, was it really that difficult? If what they tell you is that there's practically documentation, plenty of dates, everything in abundance. It's absolutely a lie. It's absolutely a lie. And here, if you want, you can ask me a question, or if not, I'll get into a very interesting topic, which is documentary authenticity.
The question I want to ask you is this. Don't the dates of Arab culture, the dates of Chinese culture, even the dates of the Aztecs, who have their own codes about when, all coincide? Above all, I wanted to ask you about history from the discovery of America to now, since that's where I've really focused. We already know that. It's not really questionable anymore, or is it still? From that time until now, from the Renaissance until now, we're clear that 5 centuries have passed, etc., right?
There's a gap in veracity, which is precisely the 16th century,
Or from the 16th century to now, it can be clearly proven true. I understand the problem posed by the revisionist theory of history is the Middle Ages and ancient times.
Indeed.
Okay, I get it, but damn, because it already is. And look, I can even buy it that there could be a lot of inconsistencies. But if you tell me, hey, no, that World War II was, it's too well documented, just like the Napoleonic era, the French Revolution. Look,
that's a very good observation. Did you know they tried to erase it from the history textbooks?
It was impossible. You can't do that.
You can't do that because we're already in an era of mass printing, newspapers, and cross-referenced information. We're discussing an era when empires dominated nearly everything. Yes.
Careful, I'm a revisionist of modern history in many ways, but when it comes to stories, of course, for example, today we have everything you mentioned at the beginning of the show. I loved what you said about how history is written with a purpose. There are always people who I believe or want to believe have the goal of trying to report the facts as objectively as possible. But unfortunately, today in Spain we are living under the historical memory law, which is a reinterpretation of the facts to suit a specific political ideology. And of course, if they're doing this now, who's to say they haven't done this throughout all of history? I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from because I'm seeing for myself how they're trying to rewrite history for me about good guys and bad guys, good, good, very good, and bad, bad, very bad. And when you start looking at other sources, damn, history isn't like that. And it's never about people being so good, or so bad, so bad. So, going back to the topic of historical revisionism and going back to the topic of the, let's say, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, history has been told to us as being much longer than it actually is. I mean, the Egyptians weren't around for 3,000 years as a civilization. That also sounds a bit, questionable. Because considering how long empires have lasted from the 16th century until now, isn't it true that 3,000 years seems absolutely outrageous? Or, using pure logic then, how many years do you really think there are? From ancient times, from the first historical records up to the Renaissance, when the printing press started to appear and cross-referenced information began to exist, as you mentioned.
To explain that, I need to make a small clarification because otherwise people won't understand it perfectly.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Just to mention the methods that have been followed to reach the conclusion, which you're asking me to explain, right? Going back to the same thing, just imagine you have a huge number of documents and chronicles, okay? And you have to organize them somehow. Like I said, it wasn't out of malice. There was no bad faith in what people did when, let's say, they made the wrong chronology. They had a methodology available to them and knowledge at their disposal, and they applied it in the best way they knew how. And let's say by making a mistake in composing the chronology, they created that long story. Now then, how can we, from the present, say how we come to the conclusion that history is much shorter, following in the footsteps of what Isaac Newton already did, except that Isaac Newton, poor guy, lived in a time when computational calculation didn't exist. Computers didn't exist. That is to say, for what has already been done, it's fine, because it's done, it's not something that needs to be done. We're not presenting a problem that someone has to solve, it's already solved. Okay, we're not putting a problem on the table. Like, let's say, oh look, how curious, let's see if someone does it, it's already done, okay? How did we get here? Later we'll discuss who did it and how. There are 4 main methods to, let's say, build an accurate timeline. In the end, history, as everyone knows, is the written record. If it's not written, it's not history. That's what prehistory is for, which is when people didn't write history. Let's say it would start with the creation of a state society, a hierarchical one, right? Orators, warriors, laborers, and logically, the written record. That's where history would begin. How is it that taking all the existing documents, the fundamental works that exist today, in other words, historians tell us A, but with the same sources they use, nothing is invented. With the same sources, the result is B. How do you get to that? There are 4 main methods. One of them is, let's say, to greatly simplify it, knowing whether 2 chronicles that apparently are different are actually talking about the same thing. For that, all you do is, you don't even need to go into what the chronicle says, but rather you look at its information volume graph. You take 2 chronicles, 2 documents, and you divide them into the same time sections. For example, if they go by years and so on. You see how much information is dedicated to each year, okay? You make a graph, and with the other chronicle, you do exactly the same, and then you just have to compare their volume graphs. You have to imagine 2 keys. How do you know if 2 keys are very similar or even the same and would open the same lock? The easiest thing anyone does, unless you have the lock to put it in and check if the door opens, is to take the pattern of the 2 keys and compare their teeth to see if the teeth are exactly the same. Most likely, unless there's a millimeter of error, which can also happen, but most likely the key is the same. So you say, oh look, this key opens the same door, okay, how is this done? On a practical level, for example, this method has been tested. You take the hidden history of Tito Livio, a great Roman historian, who supposedly tells the story of Rome from the founding of the city, 753 before Christ. Supposedly no, up until the time he lived, 7 centuries more or less of Roman history. And then you take a work written by historians, modern historians also about Rome, which tells the entire Roman history. It matches. Their volume charts match perfectly, logically, because Livio's history and the history written by a modern historian talk about the same thing. Yes.
And besides, they use as a reference what was already written. Exactly, I understand.
It's very simple, okay? It's very simple. Now then, what happens when two chronicles that you at first glance say it's impossible that they're talking about the same thing? One says the king was named Julio, the other says it was a caliph named Mahmud. One says the battle was in I don't know where, another says there was a battle, but it was somewhere else. What does that tell you? With different place names, the description seems different. But coincidentally, their volume graphs make jumps in the same places, and you overlay them.
You mean graphs and volume, right?
I repeat, with the volume graphs, you take a text, okay, and you divide it into equal sections, for example, years. The volume graph can be, for example, the lines dedicated per year. There are years when a lot of things happen and a page is dedicated to them. There are years that are very rich in content and 10 pages are dedicated to them. And there are years when absolutely nothing happens. Unless there's a drought, which only gets one line. So you start making a graph, okay, X and Y, right? Then there's a year where nothing is mentioned, a year where a lot is said, and another year where relatively little is said. And you start building those teeth of that key. I understand that graph.
Of
frequency, I don't understand. Volumes, and the other chronicle does the same. And when you superimpose them, you realize that even though they apparently talk about something that, if you read it, if you go deeper, it's what the words say you say. I don't think it's the same thing, but coincidentally, their volume graphs are exactly the same. What does that mean? That there's a very high probability that they're describing the same events, even if you can't see it.
Although not that they're describing the same events, but that they're describing the same period in history, it could also be exactly that they can't be. Okay, I understand.
And you say, well, that can happen. Well, for example, with a medieval Christian chronicle that talks about the Crusades, and with a Muslim chronicle that talks about the Crusades, they talk about the same era, each with its own perspective. Their charts may match up, really, yes, but there's much more to it. There are volume charts that match up for events that are supposedly ancient, with volume charts for events that are supposedly old, medieval, and they're separated by either 300 or 1,000 years from each other.
For example,
well,
of course, what you're telling me, you're telling me that maybe ancient times, according to, hey, correct me if I'm wrong, ancient times and the Middle Ages could be just one.
That's exactly right.
Let's see, explain this to me, okay? For example, give me an example. What population graph? How was it? Volume graph, volume chart. What volume chart has been measured exactly? That's why I asked you twice, to be very clear. The Middle Ages matches with a volume graph from ancient times. And how many years are there between the two? Well, it's just that, of course, because I really want to understand what we're talking about here.
All right, come on. After the first method, there are 3 more if you have time. For example, everyone knows about the Persian Wars, the wars between the Greeks and the Persians.
Yes, everyone. Everyone has seen 300.
Everyone has seen 300.
Everyone knows about the Punic Wars, right? I think the Persian ones, yes, but I'm less sure about the Punic Wars.
The Peloponnesian War too. Athens against Sparta. Yes, everyone knows. I think almost everyone will know that. Those who don't, well, they don't like history. Anyone who likes history has heard about those wars.
Pyrrhic victories, let's go.
Their volume charts are absolutely identical to the medieval events in Greece from the 12th to the 14th centuries. Exactly the same things happen, only with apparently different actors. Where you have Sparta, you have, for example, the Catalans, the Almogavars. Where you have Athens, you have other actors, like, for example, the Navarrese, that is the Spanish presence in Greece. All right, practically the same thing happens. Battles, events, who wins, who loses, the alliances, absolutely everything. It's just that when you read it as a normal person, you say, how curious, this reminds me of something. Then the usual thing happens. Not about the periodicities of history, because somehow you have to explain those similarities that historians have been noticing for a long time. It's just that they didn't have a way, let's say, to prove that they were really the same events. To that we add,
Careful, yes. You claim that these are the same events.
I don't. Mathematics and astronomy.
That is, There are chronologies that say the Navarros fought, careful, I don't know if it's literally like that the Navarros had a war with the Almogavares. On the Greek peninsula,
Of course, and in fact, if you go to Greece, the guides will tell you about it.
the Hellenic peninsula, right?
Yes, okay, of course. The Balkan Peninsula.
Yeah, let's see, but then let's see. This is kind of blowing my mind. And this, you said they're from the 12th century, yes.
12th, 13th, 14th. Yes, okay, if you want.
And does historical revisionism say that these two events are the same?
One of them is real, or partially real. Because remember, the 13th and 14th centuries are still a bit far from the 16th and 17th centuries, which is when the gap in veracity appears, but by force. One of the two is a ghost, doesn't exist, never existed, okay? Is that probability valid? Which one is the ghost, the more modern one or the older one? By probability, if you also add to that inside.
I mean, by probability, the Peloponnesian War didn't exist. That's actually not true.
It's not true as it is said. I know it sounds a bit crazy.
Look. This really surprises me. I mean, because the most probable thing would be that the most modern is what's most true. Therefore, the Athenians were the Spanish Navarrese.
They would be the Catalans who in fact made, let's say, the Parthenon. The Temple of Mary was a Christian church for 70 years, if I remember correctly.
Okay, but of course, it kind of blows my mind, you know?
Yes.
I know. So I'd like you to try to convince me of this.
That's very complicated in such a short time.
Well, I want to have faith, okay? I want to believe it now. All right, sell it to me well.
If we keep discussing the Peloponnesian War, you might say, for God's sake, it's obviously different. We're not talking about astronomy. Within the Peloponnesian War, there are 3 eclipses, known as Thucydides' triad of eclipses, and they can be dated, okay? The results given by Thucydides' triad of eclipses can be dated. So if you forget everything you know about history and let's say you look at it from a purely academic, mathematical, astronomical perspective, that is, you say, I don't care, it doesn't matter what year it happened, I have no preconceived bias, I'm going to do the correct calculations. And if the eclipses meet all the requirements, just as they are described in, let's say, the work of Thucydides, you do the calculation, and those eclipses, in the period that official history says the Peloponnesian War took place, did not happen. That can be determined by calculating retroactively. They occurred before the Peloponnesian War, so they no longer fit. Would they fit with the war itself? Okay, since it's said to have happened then, but it actually happened later. How much later are we talking about? Again, the 11th and 12th centuries.
When they also just happened to occur.
The events described within.
With other actors?
With other actors. And then you tell me, but how can this be possible? That is because if you analyze the principle of documentary authenticity and the principle of chain of custody, when do the sources that talk about those ancient events start to come to light? Do they start to come out? Precisely when the Italian humanists, and mainly the Byzantine humanists who were fleeing from besieged Constantinople, were escaping the fall of the Roman Empire. From east to west, and they settled mainly in Italy. They brought a lot of documents, that were medieval, but later, due to misinterpretation, they were considered ancient. Alright, why? In part, that's where there is indeed a point of, let's say, intentional manipulation of history. Remember when I mentioned a layer made of accidental mistakes? Yes, and there's another one that was intentional, political. They had to create a glorious past for Greece and Rome, which needed to be recovered in the face of the advance of Islamic barbarism. Exactly, to justify the domination of those lands, to say even today, what argument is usually used in international territorial conflicts? I was there.
Ancestral peoples?
Exactly. I mean, you always try to legitimize it, and if you can't legitimize it with force, in the end, the easiest way is force. The United States, for example, is a relatively modern country, but it doesn't care about being modern because it legitimizes itself. Everything with the 6 fleets it has spread out over its economic domain and so on. Yes, what are the poor people who lost power supposed to do? Those who are trying, let's say, to restore it. ask for help, but let's say that when you ask for that help, you have to give something in return and so on. And at the same time, you have to create a narrative. You have to create a narrative. Mythical past, glorious past. Notice something very interesting. If you notice, the great scientific advances that were made after the Renaissance were supposedly already made by the Greeks and Romans thousands of years before. Simple, by Eratosthenes. Supposedly he calculated Earth's sphericity, though many now argue it's not spherical and so on. But let's stick to the official version. I'm not taking sides since I don't know much about this, but let's go with the official view. The Earth is spherical. That's common knowledge, right? Eratosthenes supposedly calculated it using the shadow. There was an obelisk in one city and another in a different city. So the length of the shadow was different, and that's how he figured out the curvature and made his calculations more or less. How do you make those calculations when basic trigonometry, which needs zero to work, didn't exist, and positional calculation didn't exist either? Nowadays, you know that a 1 and a 0, which is 10, is more than a 9. But it's still just a 1 and a 0, only the 0 is on the right. That's called positional calculation. The Romans didn't have it, the Greeks didn't have it. They had letter numbers that represented a certain value, but the concept of 0 didn't exist. 0, supposedly, who introduced it? The Arabs, who supposedly got it from India, and the Arabic numerals and so on. When does positional mathematical calculation start to emerge? The 7th or 8th century, more or less, supposedly, according to official history. Can you tell me how they calculated? And I'm not even talking about multiplying or dividing. How did they calculate the value of the conic sections? In precession, regarding the angle of the Earth's ecliptic in relation to the Moon, which was only managed to be achieved in the 16th, 17th centuries, with people who had extensive knowledge of mathematics and who were already using positional calculation and advanced calculus. How did they do it in ancient times? And you tell me, man, there are the writings, right? Because of course there are writings. Well, I don't know, from Apollonius, from a lot of scientists. So I ask you, we're back to the same thing. Principle of documentary authenticity and chain of custody. When do those documents appear? Coincidentally, those documents start to appear in the 15th century, but really in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the most curious thing is that those documents, of those great scientific advances of antiquity, of that splendor of the ancient age, they were very splendid for calculating. By eye, they didn't have telescopes or anything, so I'm telling you, no. Advanced astronomical matters, but they weren't able to invent stirrups for horses, nor the metal plow. I mean, let's see, even simple everyday things.
They built the Parthenon and Egypt's pyramids without all those calculations?
Without all those calculations, just by eye, trial and error, supposedly very advanced constructions. In fact, if you go to Greece, the guide will tell you, as an international guide, I can tell you, I've been to many places. The guide will tell you that when they built the columns of the Parthenon, they already took into account, let's say, the imperfection of the curvature of the human eye in order to correct it. Can you tell me what calculations are necessary and how you do them without advanced math to reach that conclusion? It's absolutely, let's say, crazy. Magic, well, that's it. Then the theories start.
I get where you're going. I mean, I get your point. That's where the theories start. Like saying, hey, what if these people weren't 1,000 years ago? That's where revisionism starts, right?
But look, before reaching that conclusion, which is logical, like, hey, what if it's not that old? What if it was made in a more recent time when those kinds of knowledge did exist? People don't go that way, so where do people go? Aliens, gravitational waves to lift blocks weighing hundreds of tons, a bunch of things that are really cool for shows like Ancient Aliens and so on. It's like, oh, people,
And then we could really talk about it. In history, there are certain hieroglyphs and so on about people coming. And watch out, in many different cultures,
there are many things, but they are also interpretations. And you had to understand the symbolism of the time, not the same as the topic of giants. No, there are many depictions of giants, both on maps and in the Bible.
There's something about giants. It mentions the Nephilim.
Yes, the Nephilim and so on. Yes, the children of the angels with human women and so on. These topics, the Bible is such a fascinating subject that it would be enough for another podcast.
But yes, no, we won't have time to do it.
I know.
I know, but I'm really interested in reaching a conclusion about all this. Yes, because what you're telling me really does make sense. To sum up, there are a series of documents that are used to validate the chronology of the story. But those documents are not contemporary to the story they claim to represent. Instead, they appear much later.
Exactly.
Then there are events that are very similar. Only the actors change. But some date back to the 12th or 13th centuries and others are from the 2nd or 3rd century before Christ. Therefore, now I'll tell you. To sum all this up, the position of the story that you defend is that there are a few years that are extra.
A few, yes, a few, quite a few. Literally, what this revisionist current of history defends, that is history based on empirical, mathematical, statistical, and astronomical methods, what it defends is that, more or less, just so you get an idea, 1,000 years ago was still prehistory, and that human development since...
To this day, 1,000 years ago was prehistory.
Approximately. And that human development has gone uninterrupted, exponentially upward, since humans created the first civilization, writing. Up to our days, up to the space race, or people will say we've never been to space, but well, let's say we have. Up to modern technology like computers, cell phones, and so on, you can trace, let's say, a curve of uninterrupted development. Whereas in official history, what happens? There are hundreds of years not only of stagnation, but of regression. Knowledge isn't lost. It's impossible for it to be lost. That's a myth. That doesn't happen. Knowledge, even the dumbest of conquerors, even the most barbaric of conquerors, knows that a map is worth more than a legion. Because how did the Roman legionaries move? Can anyone show me a map of the Roman Empire? Where are the maps of the Roman Empire? There aren't any. The Tabula Peutingeriana exists, but it's from a later period, not Roman times. And also, if you follow those maps, you probably won't get to, let's say, a good destination. There are a lot of, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about small inconsistencies in history. But what I want people to understand is that with that method, and three others, which I'll mention to you very quickly, we've already mentioned, are with the same sources, knowing which ones talk about the same thing. Therefore, instead of being arranged consecutively, what you have to do is stack them and, let's say, condense them. So the story is much shorter. Another method is to know which kings and which dynasties, which lists of rulers are copies of other kings. There are biographies that are absolutely identical and that are separated by, well, millennia. And if you read it, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Of course, historians start to make things up, like saying that the chroniclers of this king were actually attributing the biography of past kings to him. They make up very strange things, all right? Very strange things to justify all of this. Then there's another method to find out if within the same chronicle at the same time there's a repetition. If a 1,000-page chronicle spends 500 pages on one topic and the next 500 just repeat it with different names and slight changes, that's what I mean. That is, it's a chronicle, a composite compilation. And logically, there's also the issue of geographic maps. If you look at supposedly ancient geographic maps, they were, wow, spectacular, right? With an incredible degree of precision. And then, in the Middle Ages, maps showed a circle with a T labeled Asia, Africa, and Europe, and nothing else. A kind of primitivism, right? That in no way reflects that scientific and technical development. It just doesn't reflect it at all. And as I said, great advances in astronomy, where they calculated the orbits and the distance from the Earth to the Sun and from the Earth to the Moon and so on and so on. And then in the Middle Ages, they told you that the Earth was, well, a flat disk, that it was inside a chest, and that the stars were the nails inside the chest. Like, for example, the book by Cosmas Indikoplostes. You wonder, how do you go from that ultra-advanced scientific knowledge, which was achieved without the necessary means to reach it, and which was only matched starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, and how can there be a gap between those logical advances from the 16th and 17th centuries onward, and between that supposed splendid antiquity? But there is, let's say, as I said, a gap of absolute ignorance, absolute lack of knowledge, absolute regression, and in many things, not just in
Within that Middle Ages, quite prominent figures appeared like St. Thomas Aquinas. Of course,
So,
to sum it up, I want you to do it for me. The division of history starts at 3000, official history, 3000 before Christ, until 476, the fall of the Roman Empire. Middle Ages, from the fall of the Roman Empire until the discovery of America in 1492, or the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1456. Three, very good, man, okay. Then it's the modern age, from these dates until the French Revolution, yes, French Revolution until now, contemporary age, yes. From your perspective, how should history be rewritten? Or let's say redate. I don't know if that word exists, but I think we can use it, yes.
redate, redraft, yes.
Redraft. Redate, well, yes, redraft sounds more formal. I'll stick with redraft. How could we redraft, or how would you redraft the chronology? Very simple, by ages, right?
It's very simple. The issue of dividing by ages is purely a historiographical matter. But let's use the same ones that exist, modern and contemporary. I'm not going to use them because really, from modern to contemporary, with the French Revolution, it's also a bit absurd. No, by the way.
There. Is it true that, or what changes if there are 300 years?
No, it's not that. No, it's not good. Yes, let's just use ancient and medieval. Of course, it's just medieval. Let's say that the oldest records would start in the Nile Delta, Egypt. There, let's say there's no dispute between the revisionist current and official history. Civilization was born in the Nile. It's just that according to the revisionist current, this would happen, we don't know exactly when, but approximately, just to give you an idea, civilization would have to start emerging, civilization, as let's say a natural consequence of agriculture, which could only have developed in Egypt as the sole center of the emergence of agriculture, and then it spread to the rest of the regions of the world. Agriculture didn't emerge in multiple centers. It began in Egypt. That's where civilization itself arises. From civitas civitatis, city, right? Civilization begins to emerge, a stratified society. Not just those who fight, those who work, and those who govern. And that's where the first historical records begin, connected to writing, logically, first to record dates, celestial phenomena, and these in turn were used for matters of harvests and agriculture. Everything was connected. Humans don't invent things for no reason. Everything serves a purpose. It's logical. You use everything for something. Did it originate in Egypt? That would be the oldest age, okay? The most ancient, the ancient age, let's call it that, all right? Then the age. Because within official history itself, the ancient age, look, from 3000 before Christ to 476, that's a crazy amount of years. Then, however, the rest of the ages start to get compressed, right? Then from there it comes, right? The development of civilization is getting faster and faster. And that's why it's a danger nowadays. We have to slow down development because we might run out of resources, and so on and so on. All that nonsense comes precisely from a mistaken conception of history. Because we believe that we've been dormant for thousands of years. And then suddenly we've had a dizzying development. But in reality, we've had a completely normal and natural, uninterrupted development. Since that ancient civilization emerged in Egypt, then civilization would move to what is now Anatolia. That's where they started working with iron, while in Egypt they were still working with copper. And there's an interesting point regarding bronze in the official history. Bronze comes before iron, and then they move on to iron. But actually, to make bronze, you need tin, which requires a more complex metallurgy, and in reality, the technique for developing tin didn't arrive until the Middle Ages. Therefore, it's very strange that they made high-quality bronze in ancient times. And this was mentioned, for example, by the physical chemist Mikael. People can also look this up if they search for it. The thing is, he doesn't come to this conclusion about the chronology. He says it's a mystery. How did they make bronze if the technology to make bronze didn't exist? It's a very strange thing. Then, within Anatolia, that empire would develop. It would come to have a thalassocratic power. It expanded throughout the Mediterranean, the great European rivers. All right? And that's what could already be considered. The not-so-ancient antiquity. Okay, there's the very ancient antiquity, like Egypt's.
Yes, okay. But the Nile, give it to me. How long ago was it? 1500.
It's not exactly known there because the historical records that exist aren't, let's say, they're not that rich and you can't trace a chronology, but more or less Figure that about 1,200 years ago, more or less, civilization would have started to emerge. About 1900 years ago, more or less. Before the present, we would already be talking about that civilization having moved. And pay attention to what I'm going to say now, the birth of Christ. The figure of Christ not only didn't appear 3,000 years after the birth of civilization, but is practically the first written record, the first historical milestone of human civilization. The figure of Christ takes on a fundamental, predominant, and much more important role within this revisionist current of history. A much more fundamental figure, a figure that at the same time has given rise, let's say, to hundreds of duplicates of Christ. Nowadays, what does official history say? Official history is extremely anti-Christian, because what they tell you is that Christ is a compilation of earlier legends. A copy from here, a copy from there, from Egypt, from Osiris, etc., from Egypt, from what they tell you is something put together. Actually, what the revisionist current of history says is completely the opposite. A real person gave rise to all those duplicates, depending on the region and the way of seeing the world. The people who adopted the story of Christ, let's say, manipulated it in their own way. Then Krishna, Osiris, Zeus, and so on and so forth were born. All of those are stories that came after Christ, not before. Up to that point, fine, Christ is a fundamental backbone, but why is he a fundamental backbone? Because he was not just the son of a poor carpenter in the Syrian-Palestinian Levant.
What was Christ based on your research?
An emperor?
Let's see. How is that possible?
Look, he was an emperor who also fought against corruption and the elites, who were mostly his own family. This has been recorded in the Byzantine chronicles as the struggle of Andronikos the Endikomnenos, who is one of the secular reflections of Christ in the non-religious chronicles, against a branch that sought to ascend to the throne, which was the Angelus family, and that's where it would draw from. The rebellion of the angels, God is a conflict, everyone knows about the rebellion of the angels. Lucifer, the fallen angel, rebellious angels, their battle against demons, heaven versus hell, and so on. We're talking about a struggle for power within that established empire. As I said, first arising in the Nile Delta and later moved to Anatolia. When they killed Christ, all right?
Yes, they did crucify him?
Yes, they did crucify him, but not on the cross that we all think of today. Because, for example, the Greeks, the Gospels were written in Greek, right? And they used the word stavros, which means post or stake. It's not a cross like this or a T-shape, it's a pillar, which later has a lot of implications. In Norse mythology, Odin was nailed to Yggdrasil, lost an eye, and was pierced with a spear. Many things, okay, are copies of Christ when Christ was killed. A civil war happens within that empire, which is what has gone down in history and is known as the Crusades. And what does it reflect? Thanks to duplication within history, thanks to that duplication and that mistaken interpretation of the sources, like the Trojan War, okay, that is, the Trojan War and the Crusades actually describe the same event. One supposedly super ancient, which it is not, and the other is medieval, but with many nuances that would also need to be specified.
In other words, Jerusalem would be Troy?
Jerusalem would be Troy, and it's not the current Jerusalem that we all know today. It emerged after the Napoleonic conquest precisely of that region, Jerusalem. If you take the Vulgate Bible, okay, and read Obadiah 1-20, you can do it now if you want, okay? It spells it out clearly. Jerusalem quae in Bosphoro est. Jerusalem, the one that's in the Bosphorus. Where is the Bosphorus? Currently, which city is the capital of a country that exists today, called Turkey, that's in the Bosphorus? Constantinople, Istanbul. Where was Troy? Near the Dardanelles, close to the Bosphorus? Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of the Gospels, has nothing to do with the current Jerusalem, absolutely nothing to do with it. In fact, all the biblical place names that have been tried to be found in present-day Jerusalem are an invention. Golgotha is laughable. Mount Golgotha, which is just a small hill, has nothing. That is to say, there is nothing biblical in present-day Jerusalem. All right, no matter how much people try to see present-day Jerusalem, it was born as a caravanserai, let's say, a city that emerged on a trade route. At first, there was, let's say, a center for worshipping a rock and so on. And then this would already be getting into other discussions and another topic.
Let's just let the audience decide.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation.
Let's just let the audience decide if we want another show, explaining the vision that he has. It blew my mind, and there are certain things that make me see that what you're saying makes sense. There are other things that really shock me and things that I just can't quite make sense of.
The same thing happened to me. Sorry to interrupt, but remember, I'm a history graduate. I studied and fully believed official history. When I read this, my reactions were, oh my God, what is this? This can't be. But what happens is that my curiosity and digging deeper into the methodology, because the important thing here isn't the conclusions, which is where this revisionist trend is attacked. The conclusions they reach are attacked. But what isn't done is to say, wait a minute, how did they reach these conclusions? All right, if you, a rational person nowadays, most of the things you're told, even by official science, if they're told to you without any depth in the methodology about how those conclusions were reached, do you believe it? Physics, chemistry, for example, the double slit experiment where atoms behave differently depending on whether you observe them or not. If you tell that to an average person, they'll say that's gibberish, that doesn't make any sense. But if you explain the methodology, how it was done, the results, it starts to make sense. Therefore, this revisionist movement needs to be analyzed very thoroughly. I finished my degree in 2015, so I've spent 10 years dedicated to studying this movement. There are dozens of books that have been written, but mainly the methodological ones are complicated because it's mathematical methodology, astronomical methodology. Although it says it's for public use, you have to take it with a grain of salt because the general public really has to be very interested in the subject.
Yeah, they're really dense as hell.
They're dense, the methodology is dense. Then the reconstruction, the examples and this and that are actually pretty simple. The thing is, you should know the official history first and then dive into revisionism. If you don't know the official history, you won't really know what they're changing for you. You have to know what A is to understand why it's not A and it's B.
You have to know it in depth, the story A. For example, knowledge like mine of history, which isn't very advanced either, is just a little above average.
Ages, empires more or less, you say ancient times. We have Egypt, Sumeria, Babylon. Yes, I know.
I basically know the major figures from each era. From ancient Egypt, then moving on to Rome, then the expansion of Islam, Charlemagne, the Spanish Reconquista. We move on to the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, then we would go to the Catholic monarchs. It's true that there's quite a big gap there, where hardly anything happens. It's true that it could make sense there, but there are too many dates, too many battles, too much of everything. For me to say I believe this 100%, but here, I always say it, I'm a seeker of the truth, and the truth is often uncomfortable. I'm not saying that what you're trying to tell me in this show I consider to be true, but I'm open to listening to any version that has a thorough study behind it. So I really appreciate that you came here to tell us your version. Do you want, gentlemen, to start for the audience? We don't have time to do more, because I'm a person who has a very busy life. If you like the show and would like to go deeper, let's set a day when we don't have a time limit of an hour and a half.
I'd be delighted.
And we can spend 2 hours here talking. Let me know if you want to know more. And I'll also say to you, Mikael, first of all, thank you for coming. I've been intrigued by the discussion about me. As a history enthusiast, it really resonated with me. And much of what you've said now makes sense. I'll give you the opportunity now. What would you say to the audience to say goodbye?
To the audience, I would say, and look, tying it to exactly what you just said, I don't want to believe, that is to say, I want to have faith.
No. It's not that I want to believe. What I want is to know the truth. Therefore, I'm inclined to believe you. Not that I want to, mind you. I expressed myself poorly.
Okay, inclined to believe. I wouldn't talk about belief because it doesn't matter what we believe, but what we can prove. And I would simply ask you, putting aside any kind of ideological bias or preconceived ideas, to try to delve deeper into this current of revisionism, which I would be happy to provide you with, bibliography and so on. Can I do a little bit of self-promotion?
Yes.
Okay, I have a channel, alright, it's very modest. In fact, it's just a margin of error compared to a big channel. Not in terms of numbers and so on, but I think I'm very technical and so on. Anyone who's interested can go there. I've been sharing information for, I think, 5 years now, and there are a lot of things that I know will be hard to get across. But there are others that maybe, if curiosity, let's say, overcomes your reluctance, let's say your rejection, this can't be, just because it can't be. Like when someone has an illness and the doctor says, hey, is this happening to you? The first thing you do is say, no, this isn't happening to me. Okay, no, it can be. The key is that little by little you say, okay, maybe this is happening to me. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and believe what they're telling me. Let's use the word trust in this person, and I'm going to try to go deeper into these topics. I really encourage you all to go deeper, to analyze. And this isn't about, as I said, believing or not believing. It's about seeing the logic and the methodological process behind it. It's very convincing, okay? It's very convincing and also very enlightening once you understand it, because there are a lot of examples given. In fact, that same methodology was applied from the 16th and 17th centuries onward, where there is no discrepancy. Or was the same methodology applied to documents after the 17th century and they haven't revealed any previous discrepancies? Yes, therefore the method is falsified, which is another requirement of any science, the falsification of the method itself, that you can subject your own postulates and methodology to criticism. And so, has anything been done? Simply thank the great Jota. It has been a real pleasure. Thank you for your patience. Very good questions. And well, guys, keep searching for the truth in this topic and many others with Jota. So, well, it's been a pleasure.
No, the pleasure has been mine. Honestly, I had a great time and my mind was really blown. I want to do another show. Let's let the audience decide. Ladies and gentlemen, leave me your comments, subscribe if you enjoyed this show, and I'll tell you one more thing. Comment if you want. Part 2. Going deeper into everything he has mentioned about the Bible, about Christ. I would love to do it, but I owe it to you all. And you know what? We're going to do it no matter what they say. So that's it, gentlemen. See you in the next episode of LA Factoria.